From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
My name is Colleen Chogan. I'm the Deputy Director of National and International Outreach at the Library of Congress, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 17th Annual National Book Festival. As you know, the National Book Festival is brought to you by generous donors and sponsors. We just want to take a moment to thank them before we start, particularly our co-chair, Mr. David Rubenstein. You too can become a donor or a sponsor of the National Book Festival. The instructions for donations are in your programs, also on your phone app and online at loc.gov. Before we begin, just a few announcements. If you have your cell phones, please power them off. And at the conclusion of our program, we will be taking questions from the audience at one of the microphones. This afternoon, it's really a distinct pleasure of mine to be joined on stage by Dr. Ronald White, the author of American Ulysses. Previously, he's written many books on Abraham Lincoln, on Lincoln's leadership, and also on Lincoln's rhetoric. But today we're going to talk about Ulysses S. Grant. If you haven't read the book yet, I can commend it to you. It was terrific. And it's 827 pages. And I was telling Dr. White beforehand, I raced through all 827 pages, and you don't hear that very often. Given the recent national conversations about the legacy of the Civil War, I can't think of a better person to hear from this afternoon at the National Book Festival. So to kick us off, as I said about in your biography, you spent years working on Abraham Lincoln, but most recently you spent 7 years working on Grant. So can you tell us why the switch from Lincoln to Grant?
I give my editor the credit. We were approaching 2011, 2015, the 150th commemoration of the Civil War. He said, "You've written on Lincoln, don't you think Grant is due for an upgrade?"
There you go. So we're going to talk about Grant today. Start us out in his early life. For example, how and why did he come to West Point?
Well, first I wanted to emphasize that the early life is important, but publishers are rushing into print biographies, but from my perspective, many of them skip very quickly over the early years. I like what Grant says. He said, "The reason that I do not read biographies is that they do not tell the story of the boy who becomes the man," what Grant calls the formative period of life. Think of your own lives, 16, 18, 20, 22 years of age, how important that was. So the traditional biography skipped over West Point, from my perspective, too quickly, so I spent a week at West Point. I gave a convocation at West Point a week ago Tuesday, because I think that was so important on Grant's life. 5 feet 1 inches tall, 115 pounds, 17 years old, he arrives at West Point, and it really is formative in shaping who he becomes.
One of the distinctive contributions in your biography of Grant is that you focus on his relationship with his wife, Julia. You quote a lot of their letters back and forth to each other. And what do you think, what does that bring to your treatment of Grant that perhaps other biographers haven't focused on?
I came early to believe that Julia had been minimalized or marginalized. Too often that's the story of women in these biographies. Julia kept all of Grant's letters. A funny incident was, I live in Southern California, and a friend who's in the movie industry approached me and said, "This would make a great television miniseries." So I was all ears, and he said, "Let's get together." I said, "Okay." He said, "Tell me some of the most important things you can about Grant." I said, "Well, I want to tell you about the marriage between Ulysses and Julia. What a wonderful marriage." And then I noticed a frown on his face, and he said, "That will never do. That will never do." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, it's all based on internal tension." I said, What? So I sent him the first few chapters, and he said, "Don't you see the internal tension?" Grant's family was strongly anti-slavery. Julia's father owned 30 slaves. Grant's family would not come to the wedding because he was marrying into a slave-holding family. Julia's father gave her 4 slaves as a wedding gift. So young people think it's only the 2 of them, but Grant had to figure out how he was going to navigate a marriage with a father-in-law who had such different views than his own. But at the end of their life in the White House, people would come upon them now holding hands like bashful lovers. They did have one of the great American marriages.
Grant served as a quartermaster in the Mexican War. Do we see any signs of early brilliance in him in this period?
He bristled against being the quartermaster. This, for him, his perspective, took him out of active duty. He sometimes broke through that and did participate, especially in a daring episode in the War of Mexico in Monterrey. I think he had latent qualities of leadership, and General Zachary Taylor picked him to be the quartermaster because he saw Grant's ability to organize, to think about the fact that you have to supply an army in a very difficult terrain. And this would come to the fore later on. Grant didn't see it at the time, but he had to supply an army in the Civil War, often marching where there were no supply lines, especially in the Battle of Vicksburg.
One of the popular conceptions of Grant is that he had a problem with alcohol, that he was an alcoholic. And you do discuss this in the book about how he departs the Army in his first departure of the Army in the first instance. But then in the remainder of the book, that simply goes away. There's not an emphasis on Grant being an alcoholic or having a problem with alcohol. Do you think that that is a popular misconception of Grant? Can you comment on that?
It is a popular misconception. I was struggling with kind of many pieces of the puzzle, and one of the pieces was Grant's drinking. I think Grant did drink. I don't think he was an alcoholic or a drunkard. When he was posted to the Pacific Coast, away from Julia, away even from the second child he'd never seen, he fell into drinking. I'm convinced he did. But the story is mixed. Different people give different reports. Grant wanted Julia with him. When Julia was with him, he did not drink. And so I think as he moved forward into his adult life, the drinking fell by the wayside. But drinking was a way that his comrades in the military would try to put him down. This guy that had this meteoric rise, they kept this story alive. Oh, he's a drunkard.
One of the most surprising elements of the book, when I was reading it, I almost couldn't believe it, I almost dropped the book, was that for a brief moment in time, Grant was a slave owner. Can you tell us how that came to pass and how he squared this, if at all, with his abolitionist father?
The slave that he owned, William, was given to him by his father-in-law. It helped him in his farming in Missouri. And if one is fortunate to visit the U.S. Grant National Historic Site, the Park Service site near St. Louis, their new film begins with the story of Grant manumitting the slave. Grant characteristically never talks about it. He was down on his luck. He had almost no money. This slave could have brought him $1,000, which was a lot of money in those days, but he freed that slave in 1859. He could not, I think, bear any longer to be a slave owner.
When the Civil War breaks out, Grant is working for his father's leather goods store in Illinois. Why does he decide to rejoin the military on the side of the Union?
Well, very quickly, he does decide that. He's the only West Point graduate in Galena. And the first letter he writes is to his father-in-law, Frederick Dent. And he tells him that he must join this war and that this war will mean the end of slavery. He then quickly writes a second letter to his own father, and he says, this war will decide who are traitors and who are patriots. I am a patriot. And he steps forward. There's no question. But the question will become, where can he serve? This becomes a more difficult part of the story.
How does Grant evolve or change during the Civil War? And what characteristic or characteristics do we see in Grant that demonstrate why he was so successful?
Grant had what I would call latent qualities of leadership, not brought out during his days at West Point, not really brought out in his first military postings. They begin to come to the surface when he leads people across the Isthmus of Panama, when he's posted to the west. And as people are dropping in hours from cholera, he alone steps forward to sort of supervise not just military men, but women and children across the Isthmus of Panama. I think if I were to give one word to it, it would be the word determination. Lincoln called it pertinacity. When he finally assumes command of all the Union forces and enters into Virginia and is stuck in this terrible place called the Wilderness, Lincoln says to his aide, if any other general had been in this situation, he would have been back on the other side of the Rapidan, back towards Washington, D.C. It is Grant's pertinacity that wins, determination.
Another special relationship, and just following up on this, that you talk about in the book is the relationship between Lincoln and Grant. How do you think and why do you think that Lincoln was able to recognize this tenacity in Grant when others didn't see it?
Well, Lincoln had made a habit of visiting all of his generals or actually having them visit him. He couldn't do that with Grant because Grant was in the West. But he saw from a distance Grant's qualities as a Western man, not presumptuous, not asking for too much, not complaining. The funny story is with Grant's drinking, Lincoln, a teetotaler, heard that Grant was drinking, and Lincoln says, well, let's find out what he was drinking and give that to all the other generals. And so they found kind of a relationship of mutual admiration. In fact, Lincoln's kind of funny here. He finally says to Grant, he says, don't tell me your plans. I can't keep secrets. I trust your plans. You carry them out and I will support you.
You do a very good job, a terrific job in the book talking about the military campaigns that Grant engaged in during the Civil War. And as someone like myself who's not a military historian, very easy to understand the campaigns, particularly the maps that you include in the book. We can't talk about all the battles, but I wonder if you could tell us a story after the Battle of the Wilderness. So this is in May of 1864, and Grant comes to a very momentous decision, a crossroads even. And can you tell us about that and how that affects the continued prosecution of the Civil War?
Well, remember, Grant had come from the West to lead an Eastern Army, and the Eastern Army was suspicious of Grant. You'd been successful in the West, but you've never faced Bobby Lee. You've never faced Bobby Lee. So Grant assumes command. The troops are not quite sure whether he's up to the task. He enters into the Wilderness, which is a scrub oak forest about 4 or 5 feet tall, where suddenly he realizes that his cavalry, horses, are of no effect. Artillery is of no effect. They didn't use the term, but friendly fire begins to take place. Men lose their location and begin to shoot at each other, and the forest catches fire. And men begin to burn to death. And they shoot themselves before the fire suffocates and kills them. So after 2 days, Grant has suffered 18,000 casualties. And a general arrives in his camp and says, I know Robert E. Lee, and he's going to do this, that, and the other. And Grant, who's a very quiet man, suddenly raises up off his haunches and says, I am tired of hearing what Robert E. Lee is going to do. Some of you seem to think he's going to turn a double somersault and land in our camp. So the next morning, Grant says, we're going to march this next evening, but don't give the word out. I've walked the Wilderness. And Grant comes down this remarkable road. It's 8:30 at night. He's riding this huge horse, Cincinnati, and the troops are gathered around. What is he going to do? And he comes to a junction. He will either turn north and retreat for the 5th time of a Union Army back towards Washington, or he'll turn south. Fortunately, we had an artist there that evening with pencil, and he describes what happens. And Grant gets to that junction, still there today, and he turns south. And the men throw their hats in the air and begin to cheer. And they begin to sing. It's a singing army. Aren't we glad to get out of the Wilderness? And that's the moment that Grant had won the command and the respect of this Union Army.
It's a terrific story. It's a very momentous point in the book. It's very dramatic, and I love the way you tell it. To fast forward into Grant's political career, often also conceived, I think, in some ways in a negative light. You do talk about the various scandals in his presidential administration. You don't shy away from that. But you have a different treatment of it because you include a chapter about Grant's views on Indian policy. You also have a chapter on Grant's war against the Ku Klux Klan. And I wanted to know, do you include those chapters in the book to try to give a more holistic view of Grant's political career, perhaps to mitigate some of the preconceptions of his scandal-ridden presidency?
Well, many of the biographies of Grant treat him much more as the Civil War general and in some ways pass over the presidency. The scandals all took place in the second term, and my conviction became that that second term unfortunately began to define both terms. So let's look at both terms. In his inaugural address in 1869, for the first time an American president says, we must address the Indian question. We've treated the Indians in this country immorally. Grant did not campaign, but he went west all the way to Denver, and he came back with this recognition, hey, the real problem is not the Indians, it's the settlers. Now he's arrayed against both Sheridan and Sherman, against his own Army colleagues, and he calls a meeting within 2 weeks of the leaders of all the Christian churches to say we must put in place a new policy for the American Indian that treats him fairly. I was much surprised by what he did with the Ku Klux Klan. He came kind of late, really, into his own anti-slavery position, but as the Republican Party was really retreating from Reconstruction, Grant stepped forward to defend the rights of the African American. Voter suppression was alive then and now. And the voter suppression then was perpetrated by the Ku Klux Klan in alliance with the Democratic Party. They wanted African Americans not to vote. We think Barack Obama was the first president elected with a non-white majority. Not so. Grant won easily the electoral vote, but he only won the popular vote because 400,000 African Americans voted for him. And so the Klan wanted to stop African Americans from voting because they knew they would vote overwhelmingly for Republicans. So one of the most exciting stories is I think Grant was the last president to stand up for African Americans until John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson. And African Americans knew this and they rallied to him. Frederick Douglass was a tremendous campaigner for Ulysses S. Grant. He really believed in him.
So last question, after I finished the book is terrifically, as I said before, terrifically well written and very well researched. And when I finished the book, I still felt as though Grant was a little bit elusive to me. I couldn't quite figure out exactly what made him tick. But I just read your book, and you spent years researching and thinking about Grant. So I wanted to ask you, is Grant elusive still to you, or do you feel like you really understand him?
Well, first, Colleen, my approach to biography is what I call from the inside out. I think often we focus on politics and military, and we focus on what a person did. So I thought I knew about Grant when I started the biography. He was obviously central in my Lincoln biography, and after about a year, I came to my own conclusion, I don't really know the man. I don't really know the man. And then towards the end of the book, I came to this conclusion, Grant was an introvert. There wasn't that terminology in the 19th century. Susan Cain wrote this great book called Quiet, in which she argues that extroverts win in our society. So Grant wasn't a good public speaker, he wasn't an extrovert, but he was a great writer. He was also a very good listener. Introverts are often better listeners than extroverts are. But it was hard to get inside of an introvert because he didn't fully reveal himself. The reason the letters to Julia are so important is he reveals himself to her in a way that he doesn't to anybody else. So he is certainly elusive, but he's also this remarkable person who, if I had one phrase to call upon, I would call it the moral courage of a man, is what I think commends him to a modern audience.
Thank you. I know you had wanted to read an excerpt from your book, and I think we have time to do that before we take questions.
When you write a prologue, you think for a long time, how would you begin a book? How would you introduce readers? People know about Abraham Lincoln, but most people do not know very much about Ulysses S. Grant. The man of middle height, accompanied by a young boy, arrived at the crowded Baltimore and Ohio Railroad station in Washington on a cold, crisp morning. It was March 8, 1864. He hailed a carriage and asked the driver to take them to Willard's Hotel. At the northwest corner of Pennsylvania Avenue and 14th Street, only 2 blocks from the White House, the man and boy stepped from the carriage and walked directly to the front desk. The man, 42 years old and wearing a travel-stained duster, asked for a room. The clerk sniffed brusquely. Did not the visitor know that in wartime Washington, few rooms were available, especially at Willard's, the finest hotel in the nation's capital? The clerk dallied, then informed the travelers he could give them a small room on the top floor. That would be fine, the man said softly. The clerk asked the guest to sign the hotel register. When the clerk turned the register around and read the signature, U.S. Grant and Son, Galena, Illinois, he turned pale. He gasped, "General Grant, why didn't you tell me who you were?" Peering more closely, the clerk could now see that underneath the duster, mostly hidden, was the blue uniform of a Union officer. Grant typically almost always wore a private's uniform, never a general's uniform. The clerk had seen posters portraying the hero of the West everywhere in Washington. Suddenly attentive, he blurted out that he was reassigning Grant and his son to Parlor Suite 6, the best in the hotel. Indeed, the same suite Abraham and Mary Lincoln had stayed in 3 years earlier when they arrived in Washington. Now that he knew who was standing in front of him, the clerk handed Grant a sealed envelope. The general opened it, finding an invitation to join President Lincoln at a reception that evening at the White House as the guest of honor. Because he had not served in the Eastern theater of the Civil War, curiosity about Grant punctuated conversations everywhere. Many knew the outline of his rise to fame, but still they wondered out loud, who was he? How had he succeeded when so many Union generals had failed over the past 3 years? Why had the president elevated him to the position of lieutenant general, the first man since George Washington to hold that rank? Why had Lincoln tapped him to come from the Western theater to lead all the Union armies? Humility and modesty are not in vogue today. This is the story of a man who is humble, who's self-effacing, who didn't say, as modern celebrities would say, "Don't you know who I am?" Grant would never have said that. He simply accepted the room, small room at the top floor of the hotel. I thought this was the best way to introduce him.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have plenty of time for questions from the audience. We'll alternate and start over here.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. I'd like you to comment on two different aspects, if you would, of the personality, getting to know Grant. Number one, if you could comment, which I believe is his order number 10, all right, where the first time in American history where U.S. citizens who happened to have been Jews he banned from the territories under his control. So that's one aspect. The second, if you could comment, get his personality, where post-presidency, the man was bankrupt and tremendous debt, yet his moral obligation, where he insisted in paying back all of his debts rather than letting them slide by, even to the extent of selling his sword to do so.
Thank you for both questions. It's order number 11. It's December 1862. Grant is very concerned that the people in Washington do not understand that they are allowing trading to take place, which is benefiting the Confederates. And many of the traders are Jewish. So he promulgates this order to stop Jewish traders. Julia will refer to this later on, that awful order. Lincoln will overturn it. And so there's a recent book called When Grant Expelled the Jews. But what happens is, I think the key ingredient we should look at readers is, are they willing and able to admit their mistakes and to learn from them? And the Jewish author suggests that Grant did, that he recognized the terrible mistake he had made, and that Grant, and you continue the story, would appoint more Jews to his administration by far than anyone else, that he became a great friend of the Jewish community, that he was present by invitation at the installation of the first Jewish synagogue in Washington, that he recognized the mistake he made and made amends for it. He felt terrible at what he had done. He changed his whole attitude towards the Jewish community as a result of that. Part of the story that made him really angry was his own father, who was always trying to benefit from Grant's position, had been hired by a Jewish company in Cincinnati and was there in the South doing this trading, and he told his father to stop this. What are you doing? Second story is Grant, at the end of his life, there were no presidential pensions. He had traveled the world. He had made some money. and so he invested the money in his son's Wall Street firm. His son was a partner. The other partner was involved in a Ponzi scheme. And on a particular day in 1864, Grant came to Wall Street to learn that he'd lost every penny. He went home, he had $81 to his name. And this is why he will end up writing his memoirs, which he didn't want to do, because he had to find a way to provide for Julia after his death. He was dying of cancer when he started writing his memoirs.
You stressed the importance of the formative years. Would you be able to compare Grant's experience at West Point versus Lee's experience at West Point? Grant's so clear that this was a war for patriotism versus traitors, Lee having a different view. And then the issue that Mrs. Grant, I gather, invited Mrs. Jefferson Davis to give the dedication to his tomb.
Yes. Thank you for the question. Lee was the rock star at West Point, the only West Point graduate never to have a demerit. They were of a different generation. Lee graduated almost 20 years before Grant. Grant didn't do so well at West Point. He was 21st out of 39, and in his memoir he says, "I must apologize." And I thought, well, why did he apologize? Well, West Point was an engineering school. The language for military study was French. All the military literature coming out of the Napoleonic Wars was French. And then Grant says, "I spent my time reading novels." So I looked in the library records of that time, and there were no novels. Novels were the sitcoms of that day. And as a strict Methodist, that was his Christian upbringing, they would have been scandalous or scurrilous. But I think great writers are invariably great readers, and I wanted to find out, what did Grant read? He tells us what he read. And that became a key for me, that Grant was a person of intellectual curiosity and imagination, and his reading was a key to understanding who he became.
If Grant was alive right now, what do you think he would say?
That's a good question.
Well, early on, when Grant, as Colleen reminded us, was in Galena, he went down to Springfield to see if he might find a position in the Union Army, and he wrote his father. He said, "I will never participate in the kind of trading and ambition that these military officers are in. That's not who I am." When he wrote to Sherman after being elected president, he said, "I was forced into it in spite of myself." We need more humility. We need more modesty. We need the ability to say, "I was wrong. I made a mistake. I'm willing to change." And that's the vision for American leadership that I think Grant helps us to see.
Being a career teacher, especially with history, we discuss presidents often, and Grant practically gets grouped with Warren G. Harding, unfortunately, in terms of our worst presidents. And like you said, probably mostly because of the second term. My question is, in terms of the Reconstruction policy, during his 2 terms, what kind of successes and failures did he have in terms, and if you just place it in the context of that whole Reconstruction period, and especially in terms of how he tried to help empower the freed black men who were trying to basically restore, some semblance of order in the South after the Civil War, and of course, some of the whites were not having that. But
yes, thank you. Well, Grant is actually rising. I participated for the first time in the C-SPAN 2017 presidential survey. It was the 3rd survey of the 21st century, and in each of these 3 surveys, Grant is rising as people recognize this. And there's 10 different categories by which you rank a president, and the highest category for Grant is social justice. It should have even been higher. He was ranked number 10 of all the American presidents. And that's because of his standing for the rights of African Americans. So Grant comes into Reconstruction with a very deferential position as a military officer. He's subservient to political officers. But then he recognizes, sadly, under Andrew Johnson, he can't take that position. He can't cooperate with Johnson. So he begins to be more politically astute, to participate with Republicans in Congress, to stand with them on the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But then as they retreat, he won't retreat. And the Republicans are even saying, well, let the South handle this. No. He said, we have to deal with this. So I think that's one of the finest moments of Grant, when he steps forward to defend the rights of the freedmen.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'd like to ask you about Grant's changing military reputation, really cause of, of course, after 1865, he's the hero of Appomattox, the one who won the war, and it continues. Then sometime around the start of the 20th century, he becomes the butcher and so on. And now, which I think is the correct interpretation, his military reputation seems to be recovering. Can you tell us why there was the change, or, I mean, there's different thoughts on it?
Yes. Well, the downturn of his reputation came about because of what we call the lost cause. This was the view propagated by Confederate generals and Southern newspaper editors that the best cause actually lost. And the only reason the South lost was that they were overwhelmed by a numerical superiority of the Union Army, the industrial might of the North, and that butcher Grant, who was willing to just let his men be killed compared to the gallant Robert E. Lee. Well, for 50 years, we've known that that's not true, but it hasn't seeped into the popular imagination, that Grant's casualties, one by one, are actually less than Lee. I've been informed by the fact that since writing the book, I've become a friend of General David Petraeus, and a week ago Tuesday, he and I together did a convocation at West Point, and Petraeus says, without question, Grant is the greatest American general. On what basis? He says, you judge a general by three categories: strategy, the overall sense of what you're doing; operation, you're leading multiple armies; and tactical, a particular battle. And he said Grant is A+ on all three. So Petraeus said to the cadets at West Point, I read Grant in preparing for the surge in Iraq, and I told my generals in Iraq to read Grant. He is the great American general, the only general who's an A in all three areas. So this has been, I've learned from this, I'm not a military expert, but this is fascinating. Grant's reputation now is really eclipsed Lee or any other, Eisenhower, any other American general.
I have a follow-up on the young reader's question earlier.
Yeah.
So how do you think Grant would feel about honoring Confederate generals with statues and that whole debate that we're having right now?
Good question. Well, first of all, Grant defended Robert E. Lee when Andrew Johnson wanted to try him for treason. He said, you need to realize, first of all, he is not a traitor. And secondly, he is what Grant called the spiritual leader of the South. And the way we treat Robert E. Lee will be the way he hoped Lee would respond. Now, Grant didn't live to see the monuments built, and the first monuments were actually built in cemeteries. As the greatest generation of that century was dying, wives and especially daughters wanted to put into the cemeteries the men who had been important, that their sons or fathers had served under them. Only later, 1890s, even 20th century, were the monuments raised in southern cities, and these often were, we want to tell you who's in charge. This is white supremacy. This is Jim Crow. So there's two different things. I think some of these deserve now to be put into museums and not on streets, but this is a very complicated issue, and we have to remember the historical reason that this came into being. I wish we did have a monument to Longstreet, who was Grant's greatest friend, because he became a follower of Grant and a Republican advocate of Reconstruction and a scalawag, a bad guy in the South. I wish we did have monuments to African Americans who were leaders. So we had very selective use of monuments.
I heard a very disturbing story about Grant's son at West Point, that he was a leader of the bullies against the one or two African American young men there. And I just wonder how that jived with his Grant as the father of this young man. How did his influence in his family not seep down to his children?
Yes, you're telling a correct story, that Grant's son was involved, his oldest son, Frederick Fred, in a bullying episode against African Americans. And you're right to ask, how does this seep down? Because at the end of Grant's life, he writes this note to Julia. He's dying of cancer. He will finish his memoirs 3 days before his death. He can't speak this to Julia. It's too emotional, so he tucks it in his coat, and she will find it after his death. And he says to her, he said, it wouldn't bother me a bit if I discovered that any of our children was lying on a bed of pain and near death. What would bother me the most was if they'd separated from the moral values that you and I have attempted to teach them. So actually the later careers of all the children are quite good, but that's an episode that is right there and there's no way of explaining it. Yeah.
I was wondering if you had any views about why there seems to be so much interest in Grant during our time. I read Gene Edward Smith's biography, which I thought was wonderful.
Yes.
And then, not long after I completed it, I saw that you had written one, and I had read your other books about Lincoln, and I saw the wonderful reviews of this book, so I had to read your book as well. And not more than probably a few days after I purchased your book, I realized that Ron Chernow was writing the biography of Grant. And I just was wondering if you have any views, why the biographies of Grant during our time?
Well, David McCullough has said well that, you know, I think we want to sort of recover people who for various reasons have been under the radar. So he did a wonderful job with John Adams and Harry Truman. And so Grant seems to be one of those figures that it's time to recover. Perhaps the celebration or commemoration of the Civil War, 2011-15, that's long after Gene Edward Smith's book, but that's also kind of put Grant back into the spotlight. The Grant, in a strange, interesting story, the Grant papers, which were for many, many, many years at Southern Illinois University, are now at Mississippi State University. Grant has returned to Mississippi. So, and it's fascinating, the president of Mississippi State is just thrilled to have the Grant papers. They're building a whole new floor to the library for this, you know. So there's a lot of things that are kind of converging here that are kind of giving a fresh impetus to take a look at Grant again.
Most of what I was going to ask you've already answered with other questions. So I'm just going to follow up and say, when you have histories, when you're writing a new history about somebody that has had many history books written, are you grappling with the history of his histories? And also, when that story changes over time, as you explained, how do you see your role and how do you grapple with the history aside from the popular notion over time?
Good question. We call this kind of in the history discipline historiography. And so, yes, different figures are viewed in different ways in the climate of opinion of that period. And there was a wonderful biography that won the Pulitzer Prize in the 1980s, but it was written in the era of the anti-war, anti-Vietnam period. And so that was not a time to lift up, will we ever again elect a general to be president of the United States? Our experiences of Vietnam and now Afghanistan and now Iraq have made some of us at least kind of jaundiced or wondering about the military. And so you have to be very aware of the historiography. But again, I feel that in every generation there's an opportunity to take a fresh look at figures. So 10, 20, 30 years from now there'll be new books on Lincoln, as well there should be. And our own questions perhaps, and our own political culture may force us to see persons in a different light than maybe earlier generations did.
One comment. At Gettysburg there is a statue of Longstreet. It's a very unique statue. And he looks like he's this huge guy riding on a hobbit horse. So I think the South did it to him again. My other question is, after all was said and done, why did Grant not have Meade at Appomattox Courthouse with him?
Very good question. When Grant came east to lead all the Union armies, General George Meade, who had won the victory at Gettysburg, was the commander of the Army of the Potomac. And Meade, who was known as Old Snapping Turtle, he had quite a temper, wrote a letter to his wife in which he said, "I'm sure that Grant will replace me. I'm sure he will bring someone from the West to be my replacement." And he was so surprised that Grant did not. And many of Grant's colleagues said, "You got to replace this guy. He doesn't do this, he doesn't do that." And Grant says, "But he does do this." And so when Grant wanted Sherman promoted one more time, he wrote to the Secretary of War and said, "You will not promote Sherman unless you promote Meade." So Grant was very magnanimous and very affirming of his own commanders. Why Meade wasn't present at Appomattox is a question I'm not really able to answer. I don't think I take it as a negative because he went out of his way to affirm Meade so many times.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Hello. Just regarding his presidency, do you have anything to say? I haven't read your book. If you have anything to say on his appointment of Anthony Comstock as Postmaster General, which I think is probably the worst thing he did. Comstock was sort of a Newt Gingrich of the time, and sorry. And he boasted that he sent 16 railroad cars full of people to prison just for having such things as what he considered pornography or condoms or anything like that. So he took over. He became America's censor, and Grant, as far as I know, did nothing about it. And was there any blowback? Do you know, did he say what a mistake he made or anything like that?
Well, cabinet officers were often as much nominated by various constituencies as they were chosen by the president. So the constituencies might be geographical, or we need someone from Pennsylvania, or we need someone from Massachusetts, or we should have someone from Illinois. If you want to accuse Grant, one of the most puzzling parts, another piece of the puzzle was, if Grant was such a good judge of character in the military, and he was, why was he not such a good judge of character in his cabinet? And he often was not. In his military, he gave people the lead to let them do what they wanted to. Ambrose Burnside, for example, who had failed miserably twice, when Ambrose Burnside came to command the army around Knoxville, Grant went out of his way to say to him, and he amazed Burnside and his staff, I trust you. I believe you know what you're doing. You know more about this than I do. So Grant gave great authority to his corps commanders. He did so in many ways to members of his cabinet, and unfortunately people he shouldn't have trusted, and he should have micromanaged if it were. And so we have to fault him at times for not understanding fully. He also had a deep DNA of loyalty. So people who had been loyal to him, he then became loyal to them, and he should have looked more closely.
Thank you. Thank you.
I wanted to ask you about presidents we never hear anything about. Hayes, Harrison, Pierce, Grover Cleveland. Is it really possible that there are no great stories there, or is it simply that the publishing industry won't publish books about people who are perceived to be failures?
Both. No, I'm sure there are great stories. I mean, Candace Millard wrote this wonderful book on Destiny of the Republic and the story of James Garfield and how she does this wonderful way she always does it, where she has alternating stories of how he's doing great things and the physicians are killing him by the way they're trying to treat his wounds. So Garfield, if he had lived, probably would have become one of our better presidents. So I think there are stories out there. I mean, there are very often president series where people try to lift up these ones. I'm not prepared to sort of say, well, of all these, this is the next one. But yeah, I think we need to perhaps from time to time take fresh looks at these people. Yeah, good comment.
We have time for one more question.
Okay. Grant, both in his Army career and also in the presidency, had trouble dealing with people who were horse trader types that were political bent or economic bent. Can you talk a little bit about how his inability to deal with those individuals ranks relative to his overall legacy?
Good question. My tipping of the balance, I think, is to try to point up the very positive things that Grant did as president, but I didn't want to minimize what he didn't do. I also think another factor in this perhaps was that Grant did not like confrontation. Maybe this is another quality of an introvert, I'm not quite sure. And so he didn't like to confront people, and he probably should have confronted. Now, sometimes he did. I mean, William Rosecrans, who probably would have been voted most likely to succeed in his class at West Point, why Grant did confront him and did let other people know Rosecrans is not the person that should be leading our army, wherever he is. But Grant should have been more of a leader in this, but that to me, because when Grant retired from the presidency in 1877, he could have won a third term. The scandals in his day did not diminish his popularity. He was incredibly popular. He almost won another term in 1880. He came very close to it when he came back from his world tour. And if he had went to the convention floor, as Julia urged him to do, he would have won the nomination over James Garfield. So I wanted to see, well, how did the people of his day assess the scandals and assess his overall popularity and achievement?
Dr. White will be signing books downstairs on the expo floor. Please have a terrific afternoon from the Library of Congress at the National Book Festival, and join me in thanking Dr. Ronald White.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.